Well, it's wonderful to be here on this Earth Day, and I was telling a few people earlier, I'm actually from California, so I always appreciate coming back to a place with real mountains. My husband, who's from North Carolina, does not appreciate that statement, because we actually live in the mountains, but he likes to tell me that the Blue Ridge Mountains are very old and wise, which is true, but I appreciate the peaks of Montana. So thank you for having me today, and I really hope that this first hour and a half is hopefully very interactive. I'm going to be showing lots of video and asking for you to sort of give me your insights into some of the video that we watch. And just to give you a little bit of a frame for some of the work that Jennifer and I do at the National Center, we've really been doing work for about 10 or 15 years on identifying the kinds of interactions in classrooms, particularly in early childhood classrooms, that really promote social and academic development. And then more recently, for about the past 6 or 7 years, we've been focusing on professional development and how do we take what we know about the kinds of interactions that really matter for enhancing development and use those to help teachers do a better job in the classroom. So I'm really going to be focusing this morning on the first piece of that. So what do we know about what effective interactions will look like? And then Jennifer will talk a little bit in the afternoon about some of the work that we've been doing around professional development. Just to sort of nod to my colleagues at INCREASE is what we call the National Center. So Bob Pianta in particular, who is the lead of that center and also the lead of the Center for Advanced Studies of Teaching and Learning at the University of Virginia, where I work. But it's a great team that we work with there. All right, so for this morning, I'm going to start off talking about what we mean by quality. And you'll see I have that in quotes because I think that's a word that often gets thrown around a lot with people meaning very different things. So we're going to talk a little bit about what quality looks like and thinking about how we might reconceptualize that a little bit. I'll talk specifically about our work using the classroom assessment scoring system as one tool to assess and improve quality. But the focus here really is on how does that tool and similar tools help us identify very specific kinds of practices that we know are important to children's development. Then I'll talk some about the research that we've done, showing that these particular kinds of interactions are really important, and also looking at some national data on what classrooms look like. And I'll end up with some of the recent policy work that we've been doing, particularly with the Office of Head Start and several states working as a part of their quality rating and improvement systems. All right, so first I just want to start off to say, I think we need to acknowledge that we're at a really unique moment in educational reform, and for early childhood in particular. There's actually a lot of money on the table, and this is very exciting, and some of us may be involved in applying for innovation grants, which are due next week, making us all very busy. There's the Race to the Top money, hopefully. Arnie Duncan just said he was rededicated to making sure that the early childhood challenge grants get funded in some way. So I think that's very exciting, and there's a very reform sort of orientation in early childhood, but also in K-12. But I also think that makes us, we need to be very careful about how we proceed, because we want to make sure that the work that we do with these funds really ultimately has the impact that we want it to have, which is to improve the lives of the children in the classrooms that we work in. And I think to do that, we just need to be very thoughtful about the work that we're doing, make sure that we're drawing from evidence, and make sure that we're thinking about implementing things that are going to be sustainable in the long term. All right, so let's talk a little bit about quality. This is a quote from Barack Obama that he made just about a year ago. So he said, even as we invest in early childhood programs, let's raise the bar for early learning programs that are falling short. Now today, some children are enrolled in excellent programs. Some children are enrolled in mediocre programs, and some are wasting away their most formative years in bad programs. And I'll tell you, and I'll share a little bit of the data that we have on that's a very accurate statement, I think, of what data actually tells us about how children are experiencing early childhood education. And quite honestly, unfortunately, what we see from national data is that more children, and particularly children at risk of school failure, are falling into the sort of mediocre classrooms, or really classrooms that we wouldn't want them to be in. So that's a problem. And so Obama says, he wants to raise the quality, show us how you'll work to ensure that children are better prepared for success. We will reward quality and incentivize excellence. So this all sounds great, right? But we all know that it's really complicated. So what does that mean, quality? How can we measure quality in a way that ultimately is really going to have the impact on children that we want it to have? And in particular, how can we make sure that all of the money being invested in sort of quality rating, quality monitoring in the context of the Office of Head Start, how can we make sure that that money is also going to help us improve things in the classroom? So this idea of sort of tying together evaluation and monitoring and professional development is a really important piece of the work that needs to happen. So historically, in the early childhood field in particular, although in K-12 as well, when we use this word quality, so teacher quality or program quality, we tended to really refer to structural aspects of quality. So things such as, does a teacher have a BA degree? What's the student-teacher ratio in the classroom? What kind of curriculum are they using? What kind of materials are in the classroom? And there's a lot of really good evidence from lots of years in research that these components of quality are important. And really that research has driven a lot of policy. So for example, the Office of Head Start, who over the past several years has changed the requirements for Head Start teachers to improve the quality of education that they have, so requiring more teachers to have AA and BA degrees. But over the past 5 or 10 years, there's also been a lot of research which shows us that although these sort of structural aspects of quality are important, they're really important to the extent that they change what teachers do in the classroom. So that is to say, education is great. We want our teachers to be highly educated, and there's lots of good reasons for that. But simply having a piece of paper that says you have a bachelor's degree is no guarantee that you're going to go into that classroom and provide the kinds of interactions that we want you to provide. So again, sometimes people look at some of the research that's come out of our shop and they say, oh, you're saying education doesn't matter. And that's not at all what we're saying. But we're saying, quite honestly, right now, the pre-service education, higher education system isn't providing the kinds of supports in the context of their prep programs to ensure that a BA means that a teacher will be providing the kinds of supports that, so I think what we want to say is education matters. It could matter even more if we think systematically about how to do that. As another example, there's been a lot of focus recently on curriculum and using evidence-based curriculum. But those of us who have spent any time in classrooms know there's a lot of times you go into a classroom and that curriculum box is sitting on a shelf. The teacher probably has never even pulled it down, or they say they're implementing it, but you who know the curriculum know that they're not implementing it in the way that it really needs to be implemented to have the effect. So the curriculum's important, but what's really important is the way that that curriculum influences the teacher's interactions in the classroom. So our work has really focused in on this, what we sort of call process quality piece. So what's actually happening in the classroom? So that piece is sort of in this middle orange circle. So interactions that teachers have with children are really central to their development. That's also a really important piece of teacher development. So teachers who feel more effective are more likely to stay in the field. But what we need to do and think about more systematically is on the input side. So how are our sort of current systems of teacher preparation, of professional development, of curriculum and evaluation helping support teachers to be effective? So most of my talk today is really going to focus on sort of unpacking what's inside this middle circle. And I think one of the things that I've been pulled and dragged into recently is more work in the K-12 world. And it's always nice to be back in early childhood because that's my home. But I have to tell you that this is such a key issue in sort of PK to 12 right now. And this idea of sort of defining what is effective practice, what makes teachers effective, is just a very central policy issue. As one example, the Gates Foundation is actually funding, I don't know, it's like a $200 million study of 4,000 teachers across the country, 4th through 10th grade, trying to sort of engineer, as they call it, the perfect measure of teacher effectiveness using observation, using student outcome data, using student report data, a variety of things. And states in all of their race to the top proposals are also working on these issues. And one of the arguments I always make, which I don't know if people really listen to very much, is that you guys should really pay some attention to the early childhood world, because they've been doing this for a really long time. You know, the idea of using standardized observation as a way of assessing program quality is something that's been happening for decades in early childhood, and that the early childhood teachers are used to being assessed in that way, in a way that the K-12 world isn't. The fact that that can be done at scale very well, at the state level, at a federal level, there are great examples of that, and I think the K-12 world has actually a lot to learn from early childhood. Again, that message is not always received well. I probably have to work on how I say it, but. All right, so how do we measure this very sort of abstract idea of teacher-child interactions or classroom processes, what's happening in the classroom? So we all know classrooms are really, really complex places. We all go in and we see very different things. And so to some degree, one of our arguments is we really need a lens through which to be viewing classrooms. And that's important because, in fact, there's great research to say that the lens that you bring into the classroom really actually impacts what you see. So if I'm going in looking for problems, guess what? I'm going to see problems. If I go in looking for, teachers' literacy and language curricular implementation, that's what I'm going to see. So, a lot of the trainings that we do nationally, are partly about training people on the class tool, but they're also partly about making people who spend time observing in classrooms aware of the sort of biases and lenses that they bring into the classroom and the way that those might influence the things that they see in the classroom. So if I can get this to work, I'm going to do a sort of silly little demonstration here for a minute. Let's see. So because this is not online, so I downloaded it. Maybe if it's going to show up or not. Let's try. Okay. So it's a little bit fuzzy, but what you're going to be asked to do is, and some of you may have seen this, if you've seen it before, just keep quiet. What you're going to be asked to do is count the number of times that the team in white passes the basketball to one another, okay? There's going to be a test at the end, so everybody count. I'm going to ask.
How many passes does the team in The answer is 13.
Okay, sorry, I just not. How many people were at 13? Okay. Now.
But did you see the moonwalking bear?
Everybody there now. How many people saw the moonwalking bear the first time? Okay, so part of that's because it was a little fuzzy, so it's harder to see, but when they're using a slightly different video, this actually comes from a research project conducted by a group, I think I want to say in Illinois, but about fewer than half of people actually see the moonwalking bear, or I think it's a gorilla in a suit in the other video, if they're primed to be counting the number of passes, because that's what your brain is doing. If you're not primed in that way, if you're just told to watch the video, then many more people actually see that, in this case, a moonwalking bear. I like the video because it illustrates that point nicely of the fact that what we're looking for influences what we see. So I apologize that this has messed with my thing in ways that make it hard for me to find where I am. Okay. Where did my... Sorry. Okay, so, so as I was saying earlier, so if we're primed to be looking for things that are going well, that's what we see. If we're primed to be looking for things that are going poorly, that's what we see. And in particular, right now in early childhood, I think there's this issue of what are our views on what good instruction is, and how does that influence not only what we see, but importantly, the kind of feedback that we would give to teachers about what they're doing in the classroom. So to bring this home a little bit more to our real lives here, I'm going to show a video of a teacher working with a group of children at a sand table, or I mean at a water table. And I want you each just to think about two things. I want you to think about sort of what this teacher is doing well, or not well, and also on a scale of 1 to 10, how you would rate this teacher in terms of her effectiveness.
What do you guys got going on over here?
I got over here for a minute.
You got over here for a minute? And what are you doing here?
I want to play.
You want to play here? What are you doing though?
Playing over here.
Playing over here?
I'm just putting the water in.
How are you getting the water in there?
That.
Just scooping it right up and pouring it in? Yeah. Is there another way that you could fill up the containers with the water? Is there another way that you could do that? Yeah, Luke has to go to the bathroom. That's all right. That's why you're staying here, right? So, can we use something else to fill these up? If we just, I mean, we could scoop them this way, right? You could scoop it like this, but look what Ananda's doing. What's Ananda doing? Oh, how is Ananda filling the cup? Yeah, what is she doing with that sponge though?
She's squirting it.
She's squeezing
I
it.
don't want to squeeze.
She's putting it down in the water and it's absorbing the water. You can't do it that way? Oh, you should try it. It's really fun. And we're gonna squeeze it out.
Look how
It absorbed all the while.
Look how I'm doing.
Very good. Look how much water that blue sponge absorbed. Look at how much. Almost halfway. I wonder if I did it again, if I could fill the whole cup. What do you think? Do you think, oh, did that big yellow sponge fill that whole cup, Jamar?
Yep.
Oh, wow. Let's see if I could do it again. I'm gonna push it down, soak it up. Do you think it's gonna fill up my cup all the way, Jamar?
No.
You don't think it will?
No.
Feel how heavy it is. Feel how heavy it is when it's wet. Feel how heavy when it's wet. Oh, squeeze it in there. Fill my cup for me. Squeeze it all out. 2 good hands. Okay, 1 minute. I'm coming, Kimberly. Okay. Oh, wow, Jamar. See, that's a great way to fill up those cups. And the water is getting absorbed. It's filling right
I know you're
up.
playing with us. I'm
Look
trying
at
to
him.
wash this sponge.
Ananda's, I know, Ananda. You're working very hard. You're filling up that container.
On this one.
I can do this one? Okay. Thank you.
All right, so what are the things that people observed in that clip first? What were the things that if you were to give feedback to that teacher on, positive or negative, that you might attend to?
Stop asking so many questions.
Yes, so there's a degree to which this teacher is sort of pushing the instructional opportunities that are there. She's really taking the lead in a way that may not be the most developmentally appropriate way to be interacting with that child. Yeah. Yes.
So they challenged him to take, his discovery and stuff further.
Right, so she's asking good questions. She's asking some open-ended questions. She's doing some repetition and extension of his language. She's introducing some new vocabulary. But the way in which this is done may leave something to be desired. Other things that people noticed.
Got down to the level of the children.
Yeah.
You know, and she was asking I wonder questions, and she modeled it along with when she was using that language. The child to know what absorb meant.
Exactly, exactly. So on the sort of emotional side, she's down at his level. She's really connected to him in a close way. And as we talked about before, she's mapping language onto actions in ways that help. Yeah?
It seems like she opened up trying and did a more child-led, and then she kind of jumped in and tried to control it. But then I saw her back off a little bit and did more of almost like a parallel play kind of thing where she was saying, this is what I'm doing, and then that drew him in, as opposed to kind of trying to tell him what to do.
Yeah, you could almost imagine, and it probably helps that there's a video camera there, that the teacher is thinking about what she's doing as she's doing it in ways that are both helping her and hurting her. And so it's a nice video to sort of illustrate, I think, how hard this work really is for teachers who, the word that we use all the time is intentional teaching. So teachers who are trying to be very intentional about the way they're interacting with kids, it's hard because there's lots of different things that you're trying to attend to. Anything else? Yeah, back there.
Well, I think one of the pieces of feedback I would give to her would be to encourage her to come alongside and sit there for a little bit without saying anything for a while in a respectful way to find out, to really see and hear what they really are doing, and then to start maybe, I wonder, or tell me about what you're doing, and get into it that way rather than coming in so hard and fast and imposing her sort of agenda on them.
Right, so spending more time observing and sort of similar, that might help her from feeling so pushed in the interaction.
He didn't look particularly engaged with her. I mean,
Right.
he was, she was just in his way.
Right.
Really. I mean,
And that's one of the really important things that I'll talk about as we talk this morning is, this is, our way of looking at classrooms is not a way of looking at teacher behavior. It's a way of looking at interactions. And that's really, really important because it's not just about asking the right questions. It's not just about asking open-ended questions. It's about, if you ask an open-ended question, do you let the kid respond? It's about if I'm sort of pushing a kid towards something that I think would be useful to him in a way, maybe I'm thinking I'm scaffolding him, is he responding in a way that's actually working, or is it not working, and do I need to modify what I'm doing to fit to make sure that the support that I'm providing is really most helpful to that child? Yeah, up here.
Well, her focus on curriculum led to not modeling social skills well.
So can you give an example?
Well, she barged in and she took charge. She didn't enter their life, and they probably didn't learn as much as they would have if she had been slower and more engaged. Social skills of listening and caring.
Right. So there's two really important things, I think, in what you said. One is this idea of that and we'll talk about there's sort of different broad domains of interactions that we want teachers to be paying attention to. The instructional and the emotional. We'll also talk about sort of classroom organization. And sometimes they're sort of trade-offs that teachers feel in doing these. And so one of the things we work on is really trying to get teachers to broaden their thinking and think about how they can provide emotional support at the same time that they're providing some of these instructional supports. And I think the other point just being this issue of trade-offs and the sort of moment-to-moment trade-offs that teachers are making is really important, and I think really emphasizes our need to have a pretty nuanced view of what's happening in the classroom so that we can attend in all interactions, in all classrooms, to things that are going well and things that are not going well. And I think that's a really key central piece to our professional development work that Jennifer will talk about this afternoon. One of the things that we do is we tend to work with teachers on a particular sort of aspect of their teaching at a single time. And Bob Pianta, who's sort of the father of a lot of this work, always pushes us around in any interaction. You can find something good that's happening and you can find something that needs work. And so I think that's really an important piece of our PD that we'll talk about in a moment. All right. So we heard lots of different sort of interpretations. How many people would rate her sort of at the low end of what they would want for a teacher? So on a 1 to 10 scale, maybe between a 1 and a 4. How many in the sort of mid-range? Maybe most of you. How many of you would rate her, like compared to other teachers you've seen, as really quite effective? So a minority, but there's still some. So I show this video in part to illustrate, again, this point of, some of us are just primed to be paying attention to different things. So some people were more focused on the instructional aspects of the classroom. Some of us are really primed to be thinking about the social emotional components of the classroom. So the classroom assessment scoring system that I'll talk about today provides one sort of way to create a lens through which to view classrooms that has some advantages. So one being is that it's sort of a reliable and validated measure. And by that I mean that we've used it for many, many years and have been able to show that people who are trained on the class learn to view classrooms in a similar way, so that if they go into classrooms, they're going to make very similar ratings. Now, and again, I'll explain more about what the class actually is in a moment, but I think this is important. One of the things we always say at the beginning of a class training is we sort of use this idea of lens and putting on glasses. The idea is you don't always have to agree 100% with a measure. But when you're using that measure, you need to have your sort of class glasses on. You need to be making your judgments in the way that other people who've been trained on the class was, and that assures us some degree of reliability. And that's really, really important, because if we're not consistent, then a measure really isn't particularly useful. So this, and then validity really speaks to the fact that we're paying attention to things that really matter. So it would be very easy for us to create observational tools that we could get high reliability on. So the example I always give is, if I asked you how many desks are in a classroom, it would be really easy for all of you to be really reliable. Hopefully you can count. Probably even our little kids in these videos could count and be reliable on that tool. But it probably wouldn't be very meaningful or valid, because it wouldn't really predict the kinds of outcomes that we care about. So for a tool to be reliable and valid, we want to show that both we can measure something consistently, but as sort of indicated in this first bullet, we want to make sure that that consistency is also measuring, sort of hitting the bullseye and measuring something that we really actually care about in terms of the kinds of outcomes that we care about. So I'll talk a little bit about the validity, particularly of the class, in a moment. So what is the class? It's an observational tool that's been developed over the past about 15 years at the University of Virginia. And it's been validated in thousands and thousands of classrooms in a lot of research in early childhood, and we also have versions that are used in elementary and now secondary classrooms as well. And importantly, it's linked to a set of professional development resources that can be used to help enhance teacher performance. So again, there's this idea that increasingly there's a need for observational tools that are used to assess program quality or program effectiveness or teacher effectiveness. But these tools are going to be most useful if they're also linked to a set of professional development resources that so that if the evaluation reveals particular areas of teaching practice that need improvement, that there are mechanisms through which teachers can make those improvements. So the class talks about what we call 3 broad domains of interaction. And actually, I meant to do this. Has anyone been to a class training? Raise your hand if you've been to a class training before. Okay, great. So not that many. That helps me. So if you have, I apologize. Some of this will be very familiar to you, but hopefully we have some new videos. So the first broad domain of interactions that we'll talk about is emotional support. So is this a classroom that is fostering children's social development, that is a nice place to be, where teachers are really sensitive to children's needs, and that is fostering a children's sense of autonomy? And again, I'll talk about each of these in much more detail in a moment. The second broad domain is what we call classroom organization. That's really about the extent to which a teacher is able to foster positive self-regulatory skills in our children, positive behavior, and assuring that children are very engaged in the work that they're doing in the classroom. So it's sort of that they're getting the most out of their school day. And the last is this idea of instructional support. And we actually often talk about sort of general instructional supports and content-specific instructional supports. Here I'll really just be talking about those general instructional supports. That is to say, the kinds of instructional supports that are consistent regardless of whether you're watching a literacy and language lesson or a math lesson or watching during a sort of center time. So these are the kinds of instructional interactions that we're really very invested in and that we show linked to student outcomes. So how does the class actually work? So the class, as you'll see here, I should have pointed this out. So The broad domains are made up of individual what we call dimensions. So for example, emotional support is made up of 4 dimensions of effective teaching. Positive climate, negative climate, teacher sensitivity, and regard for student perspectives. And each of those dimensions receives a score from 1 to 7. And again, this is based on people who have attended a training and learned to use the tool consistently. And the way that you learn to use that tool consistently to provide scores is that you use the manual that guides you. And each dimension is sort of really broken down in a much more detailed way, getting to a very sort of behavioral description. So this is an example of the sort of face page for teacher sensitivity. Gives an overall description of what teacher sensitivity is. And then there are several indicators. So awareness, is the teacher aware of what's happening in the classroom? Is the teacher then responsive to that and to individual children's needs? Is she effective? Does she actually address problems that occur? And are students in the classroom comfortable? Each of those is further broken down into fairly behavioral markers. So the idea is here to really scaffold people's observations so that they can be consistent. And based on the training, you learn to make an overall judgment from 1 to 7 on the dimension of teacher sensitivity based on this rubric. Any questions? Does that make sense to people? Okay, so I'm not going to talk in a lot of detail about how the actual tool works, but it gives a little bit of, giving a little bit of background helps. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about these broad domains, and we're going to see some video that helps illustrate what we're actually paying attention to and the kinds of interactions that are really important. And after we get a clear sense of this, then I'll talk more about some of the research linking these to student outcomes. So, go back here. So this video we'll have just a very brief little introductory material, and then we'll talk about emotional support. This is Kathy Glazer, who used to be the head of the Early Childhood Division at DOE in Virginia. She's now has a different job, and Bob Pianta's also.
Research makes it hard to deny that investment in early childhood development is the smartest strategy that we can make. There's really no more fertile period of time for investing in human capacity.
We're having a national debate right now about effective teaching. We're focusing in ways that we never have before on the importance of the teacher that is in the classroom with the children. What we're learning is that there are elements of what teachers know that are important, but it's far more important what teachers do with children in those classrooms.
That is delicious. Okay, I want that.
Okay.
All right. Make that now, don't forget.
Dozens of studies now from all across the country converge really on the finding that it is the qualities and nature of interactions between the adults and children that are responsible for the learning and development of those kids. There are a lot of ways to define quality. Our way of measuring quality involves observing the interactions that occur between teachers and kids in those settings. We use the classroom assessment scoring system to do that. We've been able to show in almost thousands of classrooms across the country that indeed when one uses a standardized, reliable way of looking at interactions, that what we're looking at is predicting children's learning and development. When we look at the interactions that adults have with kids, we generally think of them in terms of how emotionally supportive is the adult toward the children, how much does the adult organize the child's activity and attention and time in the classroom, and what is the adult doing to foster cognitive development and stimulate language and conversation with the children. On the emotional side of things, we're looking for how warm those interactions are. Does the teacher genuinely enjoy the child, and is there some reciprocity in that enjoyment?
Oh, Fidelis said we have to cheer for him, so we gotta say, go Fidelis, go Fidelis, go Fidelis, you can do it, go Fidelis, oh you did it.
A child should feel that they are supported in their growth of self-esteem, in their use of curiosity and persistence and resilience, all the types of lifelong management skills that we want every individual to have find their seeds in these very young years.
Can you help me make it like this, Master? Okay, first go a line here and then point here and then make the ears. Help me, I can't. Here, that's how you do it. That's too funny. Sorry.
So, what I love actually about that last video in particular is it really illustrates an important point that we try to make, which is, we often talk about teacher-child interactions, but when teacher-child interactions are going well, they actually foster child-child interactions that enhance what so the teacher can actually, in this case, not be present, but be influencing what's happening in that classroom. So, all of us who work in programs know that that kind of interaction that we saw between those two girls doesn't just happen naturally. One child asked another for help, that she felt comfortable asking for help. And then another child did it. The other child sort of felt empowered that I'm an important enough person that I can actually help my peer. And the sense that of comfort that they had during that interaction is something that clearly has been fostered through the teacher modeling that kind of support, making the students feel like they're people, important people who can help one another. So, So the first aspect of emotional support that we look at is called positive climate. And that's really about the emotional connection and the relationships that are fostered in the classroom. So we look at things like the quality of relationships, we look at the extent to which there's positive affect in the classroom, but again, and this is sort of the point that somebody made earlier, we're not looking for just smiley, happy teachers, but we're looking for a sense of matched affect. So that is to say, when the teacher smiles and makes a joke, do the kids respond to that in a way, or vice versa? When the kids sort of come up and make a joke, is the teacher responding to that in some way? So again, I think this emphasis on the interactive piece is really important. Is the teacher making positive communication, so making statements like, I know that you can do this, or you're doing a really nice job. That's something we hear lots. Good job, good job. But again, at the high end, what we want to see is that's really connected. So the teacher's not just going around and saying good job, but the teacher's really connecting with the work that the student is doing in a way that's making them feel more positive about their abilities. And is there a sense of respect in this classroom? So is the teacher making eye contact if eye contact is appropriate? It's one of the questions we always get is sort of about how do you deal with observing across lots of different classrooms and the sort of cultural differences that exist in classrooms and in different communities. And one of the places that this comes up the most is if you look at the class manual, under respect, one of the behavioral markers is eye contact. And so that has raised a lot of questions for people who say, I actually work in a community where eye contact is not a sign of respect between adults and young children. So how do you deal with that? And I think there's a couple of important responses. So if you remember back to sort of how the class works, an individual behavior marker is just one little piece of a much broader score. But more importantly, it comes back again to this interactive piece. So a teacher is not going to sort of get points or be scored well for getting down on the kid's level and forcing eye contact if she's working in a culture where that's going to feel uncomfortable to children and they're going to be looking away and showing some sign of discomfort. So again, it really is about this idea of interactions. All right, so we'll show a quick video on positive climate. So as you're watching this, think about, you have the sort of broad indicators of what positive climate looks like. Think about what you're seeing might indicate.
What are you painting, Zebby? Who? You're painting me? Okay, I'll sit still for you.
Can we make lions?
Do my portrait, huh?
Okay, do you want the tiger scissors? All these I want those? I'll use the tiger scissors. Do you want to cut yellow?
Those my eyes.
It's yellow. It's orange. It's the big ball is the head, okay? Here, the big ball is the head. And this,
what's that?
see this big line?
Oh, what are those?
That's for long hands.
Those are my hands?
So you said 4, right?
Four legs. Want me over there? Okay, let me know. Two little eyes.
You're a good painter, Jalita. What's that?
So what are the things that people noticed in that clip? Right. So he wasn't driving, he certainly wasn't driving the interaction in the same way that we saw. He was sort of sitting back and doing more of the observer reflective piece. What else? Yeah, so he was waiting. And actually, those are elements that we would probably pay attention to in a dimension called teacher sensitivity that I'll talk about in a moment. And this is not a class training, so it's not about you guys seeing the right things. But I think the point is, again, even in this very brief clip, we see lots of different things, and how can we unpack those and help develop a sort of common language and vocabulary around the kinds of interactions that you know, the teacher's engaging in part so that he can be more intentional about what he's doing. So, you know, related to positive climate here, you see the sort of physical proximity, so he's sitting close to her. And again, this is a really nice example of, this is not a teacher who's, you know, bubbly, I would say, but there's a clear sense of connection and this idea of sort of shared positive affect. So every time she does something, she's turning to look at him, smiling, and he's smiling back and sort of acknowledging that. So you just get a real sense of comfort in this classroom. You know, sometimes one of the things that people say to us sometimes is, how can you provide a score to something as abstract as this sort of sense of comfort that we're talking about? But, you know, one of the things that our data has shown is that we really can train people to do that reliably if we focus them on paying attention to very specific kinds of interactions. All right, so rather than keep it going back and forth between my PowerPoint, I'm just going to let you guys follow along in your PowerPoint, and I'll stay on the video. So the next broad dimension that we talk about in terms of the class is called negative climate. And the important point there is that negative climate is different from positive climate. They're not at two ends of the continuum. So in negative climate, it's the only scale that's sort of scaled in the opposite direction, so higher is worse. But we're really looking at the expression of negative affect. So are teachers irritated, annoyed, angry? Are they using sort of punitive discipline, sending kids out of the classroom? Is there a lot of peer argument and fighting happening in the classroom? And in general, we see fairly low rates of negative climate compared to some of the other dimensions. But it certainly is something that we do see, and it's something that's really concerning when we do see it. I don't have any videos illustrating high or good, which is low negative climate, but this video that we just saw would be a great example of that. There were really no indicators of negative affect. Again, it's a really comfortable thing. But it's important to note that that doesn't always happen. So there are some classrooms that can score both high on positive climate and relatively high on negative climate. That is, sometimes that happens because the teacher is generally a warm and supportive person, but there's a lot of argument and fighting amongst peers in ways that really influence the sort of feeling of the classroom. And sometimes vice versa. Sometimes the kids are generally pretty happy and working well together, but the teacher is pretty irritated and annoyed, and those interactions. So the important point being that there are really two different dimensions of teaching practice. The next broad dimension that we pay attention to is teacher sensitivity. So somebody made actually both of the comments that you made about this video that we just watched, I would say are elements of teacher sensitivity. This teacher is very, very cued into the sort of moment-to-moment things that this child is doing. So this sort of cue awareness is a really important part of teacher sensitivity. How much are teachers aware of and responsive to the individual needs of children in their classrooms? And again, I'll show just a short video.
Watch, ready? Did you see the line? See the line? Watch Alex. See how Mrs. C cuts out on the line? I'm going to do half, and then I want you to try.
I can't do it.
You can do it.
No?
Here, I'm going to help you.
Me. I'm done when I'm
Madison, Jamar, I would say about 5
Open, shut them.
And then if someone else is... No, you've been You can do it, look.
I would like you to draw yourself a picture. There's some paper over there.
Good.
I'm actually,
Cut around the line. Hold on, DJ. I'll be right with you, okay?
Is Kelly gonna come in today?
I don't think
Afternoon.
she may.
So I won't show the whole thing at the end. He does it, and he's very excited about having accomplished that. And one of the sort of general principles that we talk about in terms of the class, really across dimensions, is this idea of teachers, when they're working well, are really creating learning opportunities. And this is a great example of that. You notice the teacher said, we're going to cut this out, and he said, I can't do that. You can imagine how easy it would have been for the teacher to say, okay, well, let's do something else, or here, let me do it for you. But rather than doing that, she really was sensitive to what that child needed in the moment and was able to support him in a way that he could do it himself. So that idea of sort of teachers working moment to moment to sort of create, to recognize and create these learning moments is really a central piece of the work. The last dimension that we assess as a part of this broader construct of emotional support is called regard for student perspectives. And that's really about the extent to which the teacher is working in ways that are supporting student autonomy, that are very sort of child-oriented rather than very teacher-driven. So I won't show another video because actually I think that first video that we saw is a really nice illustration of a teacher who would not score very well on regard for student perspectives because she was really pushing her agenda. So we see this a lot in classrooms where at the high end, it's all about what I'm planning to do today, and a child comes in with a different idea, and teachers can't be flexible and sort of go with the lead of the child, or who feel such a need for control in the classroom. Everybody sit on your lines. That they're not able to allow the kind of movement that we know is necessary for 3- and 4-year-olds, and having teachers recognize that you can sort of loosen up a little bit if you have, and we'll talk about behavior management in a minute, but if you have a well-managed classroom, kids should be able to move around and use their bodies in ways that 3- and 4-year-olds want to do, and that's really actually going to nurture their learning and social development. So then the second broad domain of interactions that we pay attention to is called classroom organization, as I said, and this looks at 3 different dimensions. So one is behavior management, which is fairly self-explanatory, and productivity and instructional learning formats. So we'll talk first about behavior management, and I have a very short little clip that nicely illustrates a teacher where things are going well.
Go do your job. Thank you, friends. It is time for us to clean up and put everything away so we can go outside. Louise, freeze, please. Make sure everything is put away in the right place, okay? And then you may get your jackets and come on the red line. Okay, Tyza? Clean up, clean.
So one of the things I like actually about that video is it illustrates, you can imagine how many people think this is the first day of school. Behavior management, when it's done well, and there's actually research to support this, builds over the course of the year. So this teacher has clearly worked for a long time with these kids to develop a sense of routine on what her expectations are around behavior. But even that, she recognizes that with 4-year-olds, you still want to provide those reminders and those sort of cues to them about what the expectations are that then help allow them to be most successful during, in this case, that transition. So I think it's a nice video for illustrating that point. And in fact, one of the things that happens in the class with behavior management is that at the very high end, sometimes we see classrooms where we actually don't see any of the sort of very specific behavioral things that we're looking for. So we're looking for teachers to be proactive, and we're looking for teachers to set very clear expectations. Sometimes, like in classrooms like this, things are functioning so well. There's a sense of this sort of everybody knows what's expected of them, that we don't even see teachers having to do that very much. But again, that's not something that happens at the beginning of the year, and teachers really need to work on with children on establishing those routines so that they're successful. The next piece of, the next sort of major dimension of interactions that we talk about in terms of classroom organization is what we call productivity. And I don't love that word. Somebody the other day recommended to me that we change it to time use, which is probably better because it has this sort of mechanistic implications to it. But really, productivity is about the extent to which teachers are organizing the classrooms in ways to help kids get the most out of their day. So is there a clear sense of routine in the classroom? Do children know what they're supposed to be doing and how they're supposed to be going about it? Are transitions very efficient? And do teachers actually embed learning opportunities in the context of transitions so that children don't spend a lot of time wasting time? And this is something that is very, very critical in early childhood, and one of the pieces of data that I think has been most shocking to people from some of the studies that we've done. So data actually show that when we observe in about 700 classrooms, these were all actually state pre-K classrooms across 11 different states, that the average pre-K child spends 42% of their day engaged in non-instructional activities. And instructional activities were defined very, very broadly. So singing a song, pretty much anything that you were doing would count. So that 42% of that time, almost half of their time, they're waiting in line, sitting, waiting for the next thing to happen, maybe engaged in sort of routine activities like washing hands, et cetera. So again, we know all those things need to happen, but the idea is, are teachers conducting them in ways that are going to help kids really get the most out of their learning? This is something I'm very sensitized to because I have a 3-year-old who was, when he was 2, kicked out of a center for biting, and he bit because they were sitting with 15 different 2-year-olds all waiting in line to wash their hands. And the teacher described this to me and said, well, but he just couldn't wait his turn, and so he went up and bit. Granted, that was not appropriate. But again, are there ways that teachers can be structuring time use so that kids aren't just sitting around and waiting? Also, let's not kick out kids, but that's a whole nother issue. All right, so then the last dimension in instructional or in classroom organization that we look at is called instructional learning formats. And that really is about what are teachers doing to engage kids, both in terms of the sort of materials and modalities that are in the classroom, but most importantly, are teachers actually engaged with kids, or are they sitting talking to another teacher in the back of the room? Are teachers really scaffolding children's engagement so that during center time, they're walking around the classroom and actually working and talking with children? And data really show that this aspect, sort of classroom organization, is the aspect of the classroom environment that really contributes to children's self-regulatory skills. So children's abilities to sort of get the most out of the school day are really enhanced by these kinds of classroom organizational techniques. All right, so the last area that we'll talk about is called instructional support. And I'm just going to show one video, which then we can sort of talk about through different pieces. So there are 3 different pieces of instructional supports that we look at. One is called concept development, which really looks at teachers' abilities to foster students' higher order thinking skills, the extent to which they're making connections for kids, or sort of integrating across the different things that children know, making real world connections. And then there's the quality of feedback. Again, this is a thing that we know from national data. The average child gets almost no feedback in a given day. So we're attending both to the quantity of feedback, but also the quality of feedback. Are teachers just going around and saying good job, or are they down with working with children and sort of scaffolding and supporting so that children can perform at a higher level? And then the last area is language modeling, so really looking at the language environment of the classroom.
This is what I have 2.
You have 2 what?
I have 2 milk.
You do. You have a milk and you have orange juice. So what did you do this weekend? You had Saturday and Sunday off this weekend.
woke up early, and then I saw.
I'm gonna start with the J.
My dad wake up. I got hear my dad wake up.
You heard your dad wake up?
Then while I was walking, while I just woke up, my dad woke me up, and I just saw him come right in my room while I was in the room.
He did?
Yeah.
Were you ready to wake up, or did he just wake you up, but you were still tired?
He just woke me up while my eyes shut. I was sleepwalking to my dad.
Were you?
Yeah, and I opened my eyes.
What is sleepwalking? What does that mean?
Grabbing food.
Oh, it does? It's when you grab food?
Yeah, that's like in my movie.
Oh, was there a sleepwalker in your movie? I'll have to check that out. That's interesting.
And then when his buddy he has lashes.
So that's what you do when you sleepwalk?
Yeah, I just woke up, shut my eyes again, then I grabbed food.
So what did you eat when you were sleepwalking?
Chicken.
Chicken?
Yeah.
That's like a midnight snack.
I just put it on my face.
You did?
Yeah.
Was it cold chicken or warm chicken?
Cold chicken.
Cold? Oh, I like my chicken heated up. You like cold chicken?
I like hot chicken.
You do, but when you're sleepwalking, you don't know if it's cold or hot, right? Because your eyes are closed.
Yeah.
So how did you know it was chicken if your eyes were closed?
I just opened my eyes, then I just feel it.
Oh, you felt what it felt like?
Then I was in the refrigerator, I opened the refrigerator, grabbed it, and then I woke up, and then I had my...
So what kind of chicken was it? Was it fried chicken, baked chicken?
It's fried chicken.
Fried chicken? Oh, Miss Witham loves.
All right. So other than the fact that the child is totally adorable, what did people notice in that interaction that you think might be a part of this sort of broader domain of instructional supports? Right. Right, so that would be under sort of language modeling. One of the pieces we look at is advanced language. So again, this is a place where that child's already using that word, so he knows it, but there's an extent to which she's sort of emphasizing his knowledge of it. And it's clear that it maybe wasn't entirely clear, at least his sort of brain structures could be reinforced for what it means, because what did he say when asked what sleepwalking was? Yeah, throwing a lot of food in your mouth, right? And so another piece of what we see in terms of feedback is this is a really nice example of a teacher then sort of working with a child to get him to sort of what sleepwalking actually meant. And it wasn't that she was looking for him to get the right answer, but she was really just sort of structuring and scaffolding his interactions. Anything else that people noticed?
Well, it resulted in his ability to keep adding more events onto his narrative.
Yeah, it's a really nice example of sort of a naturalistic narrative. This teacher, you can sort of see, hopefully, it's intentional on the teacher's part to be enacting this narrative. But in the context, and this is an important part of concept development, in the context of this child's real world, so that he's feeling connected to this narrative and to this conversation that they're having. Yeah, over there.
At the very beginning of the conversation, she incorporated probably other learning components from the classroom, like calendars. So she asked what you did this weekend, and she said you had Saturday and Sunday.
Nice. So this idea of integration across areas of the curriculum, and again, this is just a great example of a teacher creating a learning opportunity, because this child is having their breakfast. So you could imagine this child could just be sitting there having his breakfast, but by the teacher taking the time to sit by the child, ask open-ended questions, really have conversation with a child, which we find is something that teachers have a hard time doing, having real, authentic conversations. This child is just getting a lot of opportunities which are fostering his language development and his cognitive development. So those are the kinds of interactions that we pay attention to in the context of instructional supports. All right. All right, so now I'm going to talk about the data part of this. So what do we know about these interactions? Why should we care about these kinds of interactions that we've all been talking about, other than the sort of face valid, these are the things that we should be caring about? Well, we do have data from thousands of classrooms using the class that suggest that children who are in classrooms that have higher class scores, but really that have teachers who are providing emotionally supportive environments that are well organized such that children are able to sort of get the most out of the school day, and that are fostering their cognitive and language development, we really see gains socially and academically for children. And this is actually research using the class shows this, but there's also lots of other research using other observational measures that really clearly indicates that these interactions between teachers and children are particularly important. And they're really, really important for the children that we're most concerned about. So we also have data, I'll show you some in a moment, that suggests that it's the children who are sort of at risk for school failure who are most likely to benefit from being in classrooms that are providing these kinds of social, emotional, and instructional supports. We also know, unfortunately, that too few children are exposed to these types of effective interactions in early childhood, but really across early childhood and into elementary school. So in one study that followed about 1,000 children from early childhood, they're actually now in high school, but that did observations throughout that period, showed that between preschool and 5th grade, only 10% of children were consistently in the kinds of classrooms that offer enough sort of instructional and emotional support to really foster development. And even worse, that kids at risk of school failure are more likely, or are less likely to be in those kinds of classrooms. I think this point, it also, the other important point here is that all of our investments into early childhood have to be connected to work that we're doing around transition to elementary schools and connecting with elementary schools, so that sort of the sad results from the recent Head Start Impact Study, that we can show gains for early childhood in the context of early childhood programs in Head Start, but those disappear in elementary school if we're not paying more attention to the consistency with which children receive exposure to these good environments. So here's just an example of one study from one of my colleagues, Andy Mashburn, that was in child development in 2008. And this sort of took a sort of policy approach to looking at what are the factors of the sort of broad construct of quality that really help predict gains in children's social and sort of early academic performance during the during the preschool year. So we looked at children's performance at the end of preschool, controlling for how they were doing at the beginning of preschool, and then looked at the extent to which, and this was about 2,400 children in 700 classrooms in 11 states, all of them in state pre-K programs. Excuse me. And what we saw is there was really no association between any of the measures that we have of sort of infrastructure or design quality, so things like whether or not the teacher had a BA, ratio, sort of whether or not the program offered additional kinds of services to families. Those kinds of things were not connected to children's learning. Now again, this sort of goes back to the point I made earlier. That's not to say those aren't important, but at the current moment, those kinds of metrics of quality are just too distal from children's actual experiences in the classroom. We also had the Eckers in this study, and classrooms that were scoring higher on the Eckers had children who made greater gains in expressive language. But the things that we saw most connected to children's academic performance were the things that we were measuring in instructional support in the class. So the extent to which teachers are really fostering higher order thinking skills and providing feedback to children were predictive of gains across a broad range of academic outcomes. And similarly, in terms of children's emotional support, we saw that that was really the most important piece for predicting gains in children's social development. These data actually come from first grade, but I like to show them because they're a very nice illustration of the potential impact that interactions can have. So the way the study worked was we followed a group of children from preschool into first grade. And we identified children who were actually in kindergarten identified as at risk of school failure because of having emotional and behavioral problems. So they were scoring poorly on measures of attention, and their teachers rated that they were having lots of problems adjusting to the school environment. These were their kindergarten teachers. Now we follow these kids into first grade, and we have a little bit of a natural experiment. So it's not a randomized control trial, but But what we see is, for the most part, children are somewhat randomly then sorted into classrooms that are offering low emotional support, moderate levels of emotional support, or high levels of emotional support. And we looked at how they were doing, controlling for their previous performance. So these can really be interpreted as sort of gains in performance across the first grade year. And what you're seeing here on the y-axis is actually an academic outcome. So it's children's performance on a standardized test of achievement, the Woodcock-Johnson. And what we see is, for those kids who are at risk of school failure due to having lots of sort of behavioral problems, the levels of emotional support that are provided in the classroom are actually predicting to academic gains. So this is like a little bit of a duh for those of us who believe in this. But it's really important. I think it's particularly important for the K-12 world that tends to be so focused on instruction. But because it acknowledges not only do interactions matter, but actually the sort of mushy side of interactions, the social emotional interactions that we care about, are actually predicting to children's academic performance. And this data just sort of summarizes what we see. So these data come, again, from studies of about 700 pre-K classrooms. We also then followed the kids into kindergarten and have data on about 700 kindergarten classrooms, and those look basically the same. And what we see is that most classrooms look sort of moderately emotionally supportive, decently well organized, but instructional supports are really, really low. And that's a reflection of a couple of things. For one, there are just no instructional opportunities for lots of kids during a lot of the time. To the extent that there are, they tend to be very rote. So teachers sort of giving children flashcards, et cetera. But this piece of supporting higher order thinking skills, of providing feedback to children, of developing language, are just not things that we're seeing in the typical early childhood program. And again, these are state-funded pre-K programs. There's a lot of variability in those programs across the states that were in this data set. But we know, if we think about the sort of broader context of early childhood, it's probably not going to look much better than this, and there's data to suggest the case that that's true. And again, remembering back to the kinds of instructional supports that are the kinds of supports that matter most for children's academic performance, it really is these instructional supports. So that's really focused some attention on the ways in which we might foster and enhance these kinds of instructional supports in the classroom that Jennifer will talk about later. All right, so because we've been working in the policy world recently, which many days I just want to go running back to my office and away from policy, but it's important. So we've gotten asked these questions sort of about threshold effects. So the question is, how good does quality have to be before we start to see the kinds of outcomes that we want to see? So if you've developed this thing called the class, and you've sort of artificially created these categories that go from 1 to 7. So how good is good enough? It's sort of like the old idea of good enough parenting. And what we see from the data is that in terms of sort of social emotional supports, we really need to see classrooms at the sort of high end of mid to high end of the scale before we start to see change. So the way to think about this is, for the most part, in terms of development of children's social confidence, if I go into a classroom that's just horrid in terms of emotional support and would score a 1 on the class, then I go into a classroom that's kind of okay, it's mediocre on a 1 to 7 scale, it would score a 4. Really, the difference between those classrooms isn't very meaningful in terms of children's social development. Where we start to see changes in children's social development is at the higher end of the scale. So the difference between a 4 and a 5 or a 6 is really meaningful. And to put that into sort of a real world context, that is, so a classroom that's sort of just mediocre in terms of its emotional support is not enhancing social development, but one that's providing those kinds of supports most of the time is starting to really produce the kinds of outcomes that we're interested in. Again, these are not data from randomized control trials, so we have to interpret them cautiously. We'll present some data from RCTs later that will emphasize that point. And the numbers on the bottom just talk about the percentage of classrooms across the 700 state-funded pre-K classrooms that would score in that range of quality. So in this case, a little less than half of the classrooms across the country that we observed were providing the kinds of emotional supports that are predictive of children's social development. But you can see there's a pretty broad range. So 10% of the classrooms are providing very, very low emotional supports. And again, unfortunately, the children who are sort of most in need of those kinds of supports are more likely to get some of those lower quality supports. In terms of instruction, the picture is actually somewhat different. So in terms of children's expressive language skills, math skills, and receptive language skills, the difference even between a 1 and a 3 is meaningful. So again, to put that into a real world context, the difference between a child in a classroom where they're getting basically no instructional opportunities and a classroom where those are happening at least just occasionally, where the teacher is sometimes supporting, providing feedback and sometimes providing opportunities for children to sort of really think critically about their world, that those are meaningful differences that are really predicting to gains in children's academic performance. For our pre-reading skills, we actually really see that you need to be somewhat higher. So those kinds of outcomes we don't start to see until teachers at the higher end of the scale. And again, this sort of percentages on the bottom illustrate that very, very few of our classrooms are at that sort of higher range of quality that we'd be interested in terms of instructional supports. Okay, I guess I said that already. So just to conclude again, Jennifer later today is going to be talking much more about PD, but the work that we've been doing for the past 6 or 7 years has really sort of stemmed directly from this work. So as we did this work and we started to see two things. One, we get to know more and more about the specific kinds of interactions that really matter for producing positive outcomes for our children. And that when we look across broad numbers of classrooms, we see lots of need, and lots of need for professional development support. Can we build professional development supports that are really directly linked to the kinds of outcomes that we want to see for teachers? And so Jennifer will talk about various work that we've done in terms of coaching models, in terms of coursework, and also trying to think through what are some sort of scalable interventions in terms of providing some supports over the web. And I want to end talking just briefly about the use of the class in policy contexts. So as I said, there have been many days when I want to go running away from this work because it's been very challenging. But I think it's important. So for those of you who work in Head Start settings, you may know this, but the Office of Head Start about 2 years ago, during the reauthorization of Head Start Act, was required to choose an observational assessment of teacher-child interactions to include as a part of their monitoring system. They decided to use the class for that. So what does that mean? That means that now all Head Start grantees every 3rd year during their triennial review, a part of that review focuses on classroom interactions, and the class is conducted in a sample of classrooms. And that information, in this case, in the case of monitoring, it's just provided back really at the grantee level, so it's not used to provide individual feedback to teachers, but it's really just used at the broad monitoring level. A couple of things that have come out of this work. One is it was a nice illustration of the ways that observation can be used at a really broad scale. So the Office of Head Start, we trained a group of about 20 of their trainers, and then they led about 2,000 trainings. I mean, they trained about 2,000 people in lots of trainings all across the country in the course of a year, with a fairly high success rate. The other really important piece is that throughout this work, we've really, again, pushed this idea that it is insufficient to use a tool such as the class as a monitoring tool. You have to be investing on the PD side. So they actually really have done that, and they've used a lot of their stimulus dollars to focus money on supporting particularly their TA network to help teachers in Head Start programs learn more about the kinds of interactions that foster social and emotional development and cognitive development. The other context in which the class is being used and other observational measures include quality rating and improvement systems. And I should have known this coming. Does Montana have a quality rating improvement system? Yes. So, you know, as those of you may know, these systems are getting sort of are being increasingly pushed as a way of helping support change and improvement in early childhood. And again, the idea is, you know, there are lots of different pieces of program quality that we want to be paying attention to. But if we think about using observation as sort of a way of really making sure that we're getting all the way into the classroom, so we're not just providing programs with feedback about their use of their financial dollars and about the number of accredited teachers in the classroom. Again, those things are important. but let's also make sure that we're providing them with feedback and support on the things that are happening in the classroom. And then there are several other places. The City of Chicago actually assessed all 1,600 of their early childhood programs with a class, and then are providing aligned professional development supports from that. And one of the really important things that I always like to point out is that, the class is not measuring anything new. These are all the things that we know are important. I think it offers a way to do that pretty effectively and efficiently. But it's important to always recognize that there are lots of professional development experiences, and some that have been validated in the context of RCTs that improve interactions that aren't sort of things that we developed or things that are specifically class focused. So, for example, the work that Sibel Raver has done in Chicago using Webster Stratton's program, working with teachers, trying to reduce teacher stress, and also helping them engage in more effective behavior management strategies, shows changes on the class. So there's lots of different kinds of professional developments that can enhance effective interactions. What they have in common is they're actually paying attention to interaction. So they're sort of getting PD experiences that they're getting their hands dirty and talking with teachers about their daily experiences with children. So with that, I will end. And my contact information is up here, and also more information about the class and some of our research is available there. And please do feel free to email me if you have questions or would like any of the papers that I've talked about today. So thank you. Okay, great. So about 5 minutes for questions. Sorry, I didn't leave very much time. But does anyone have questions?
The name of the person who's working in Chicago on teacher stress management?
Yeah, so it's Sibel Raver, R-A-V-E-R. She's actually at New York University, but she had a project called the Chicago School Readiness Project, I believe. And they're continuing to use that model. So it's a combination of Webster Stratton's model for working with teachers, but also with directly offering some stress management techniques and trainings to children, to teachers. Mm-hmm. Other questions? Yeah.
One that is close by, actually, in Montana, having a conference, a state conference. So is there anyone that's closer by that would want?
If you send me an email, I can. So the question was, are there people local in Montana who have been trained and who know something about the class who could talk about it at a local? And the answer is probably. And if you send me an email, I can see if we can find somebody. Yeah. There's a.
About the Head Start Training and Technology Systems Center. We've got a training here in Missoula next week. We're doing one right now in Billings, and then in the middle of May we've got 2 sessions in Great Falls. Maybe we can talk to you. Sure. State and any voice comments. Great.
The video clips that you showed, are they from the class sort of curriculum themselves? Are they available to embed and use in training or in service training?
Right. So these clips specifically came from a program called Understanding the Class Framework that we started a nonprofit several years ago called Teachstone that is doing some of this work. So that program is available through Teachstone. We also, there's a class video library it's a subscription service. But if anyone's interested in looking at that, I'd be happy to set up trial accounts for you. So some of the videos are on that website as well. Yeah.
What was the name of the nonprofit?
It's called Teachstone. We only paid $10,000 to find that name. Other questions? All right, well, I think on the schedule is a break right now, 15 minutes or so. And I'll be around all day, so if people want to just have more informal conversations, I would look forward to it. So thanks again.